Okay, so I'm Mike Small, and I'm a Senior Analyst with KuppingerCole, and I have been looking into security in the cloud for many years now, and for many of the reasons that were mentioned by Nat in the earlier part of this talk. So what this today's session is going to be about is that we're going to look at how you can compare cloud access security brokers in a practical world. And you will find through my presentation that not all are the same, and that hopefully what I will be able to talk about today will help you to make a wise choice. And at the end of this, there will be a few minutes for your questions, which I believe Kevin will be collecting. If you could make them through the chat channel, then we'll try our best to answer them when we come to the end. Now, the interesting thing is that the impact of COVID, because many organizations were already in digital transformation mode, and they were trying to use technologies like big data and agile development and so forth to accelerate their digital transformation. Well, actually, COVID has just wiped everything out, because organizations are now moving from simply trying to do better to simply trying to survive. Retailers have had to close their physical sales channels. Manufacturers have had to reorganize their shop floors, and employees are now working from home. And all of this has led to an unprecedented acceleration in the change in the way in which people are doing business. And we will look back, I think, in some years' time on 2020 as being an inflection point in the way in which the world works and how we do business, how we travel, and so forth. Now, having said that, the challenges remain, that there is this creative tension that is created by these new technologies and these new ways of doing work. That in terms of the C-level suite, there was probably an IT transformation leader who was just trying to get things done, and that has changed from just trying to get things done to how are we going to survive in this new world unless we adopt these new technologies. But at the same time, you have the concerns which have not gone away, that using these services which are outside of your control has caused the CISO to ask the question, how is this going to alter our security posture? And in a sense, the security team, the IT security team, which had grown up learning how to implement security, has suddenly found itself with the problem of how do you assure security? How do you ensure that your employees are not using things that are insecure? And many industries now are highly regulated. And to take just one of them, the finance industry in particular is very heavily regulated. And when these regulated industries are using the cloud, using these new kinds of services, then the risk and compliance teams start to ask the questions of how can we be sure that when we are using these systems, that in fact we are meeting our obligations. And for the industries that are regulated, and one that really springs to mind at the moment is the pharmaceutical industry. because there has been an enormous amount of work which has gone into the development of the vaccines, which is quite miraculous. But in order to pass through the tests, there is an enormous amount of accumulation of data that it almost certainly is involving the use of cloud services. Now, Nat talked about concerns, and recently we ran a cyber security leadership summit, which of course, like nearly all events, was a virtual, which was a shame because in the past it has been in Berlin, which is an interesting city to visit, and I strongly encourage you to visit when restrictions are lifted. But at this, we had a poll of the attendees who were all senior or C-level security practitioners, and we asked them what their top concerns were. And interesting, the first of their concerns was zero trust, was implementing zero trust in their environment. And this is showing the fact that you no longer can consider that you have control over the network that you are using. And it's no longer sufficient to say, well, I know that the servers and the services that I'm attaching to are in fact secure because they're under my control. The second thing was that in this current world, we have a hybrid IT delivery environment. Now, different people argue about exactly what hybrid means, but in effect, in reality, what we have is we have on-premises devices, we have at-home devices, we have devices in manufacturing environments, we have devices and servers in data centers, and we have multiple cloud services. And this is a very complex environment. It was hard enough to secure it when it was all in one building with a lock on the door. And now it's all distributed, and an awful lot of it is outside of your immediate control. And whilst you may be able to secure your shop or your manufacturing place, it's another thing entirely if your employees are working from home or working from mobile devices as they move around the world. So what basically this means is that COVID has meant that we have to adapt or to die. And there is no alternative but accepting these new ways of working. Now, one of the complexities that comes from this is that in the use of cloud services, there is a shared responsibility model. And many organizations have not fully understood what that implies. Most cloud service providers will make sure that they tell you there is a shared responsibility because they know that it's more likely that you will make a mistake than that they will. So it's really important to be able to understand what you are responsible for. But in fact, you've got the problem that all of the different service providers have their own control sets. And, you have to understand what they are doing with these different control sets. And different kinds of cloud services involve different levels of responsibility. So, for example, if you are using software as a service, the cloud service provider is responsible for many more things than if you are a tenant in an infrastructure as a service. So this is an incredibly complex web that you need to manage. And it's made worse because ultimately, wherever you're processing this data, you are going to be held liable for the data that you are holding and processing wherever it is, and how that data is used and accessed. And that is what leads us on to the need for control over access. That whereas 20 years ago, I would talk to CIOs and they would say, we've secured our perimeter, we're done. Now there is no perimeter. Access control by everything is what is essential. Now there's a lot of confusion over what is the issue. And I like to look at it at a very top level. That the problem is that whilst you may have had, for what you thought were your previous ways of working, a set of effective controls and control over vulnerabilities. But the trouble with the cloud is that those controls may no longer be effective, and there are all kinds of vulnerabilities that you may not be aware of. And that will lead to these problems of failure to comply, all kinds of opportunities for fraud, and in the worst case, loss of business continuity through poisoning of your systems through ransomware and things like this. And indeed, we've already seen in the UK reports of how the government cloud-based system for giving out benefits for people affected by COVID have been targeted by fraudsters, and many hundreds of millions of pounds have apparently been paid out. Now, the point is that many of these vulnerabilities, many of these controls can be greatly improved through the use of this technology called cloud access security brokers, which are effectively providing a control over who can access which cloud services, and at the same time looking at the security posture that is being adopted for the things that you can control within those services. And that is going to lead to improved compliance, improved reduction in fraud, and protection of malware. Now, I'm a security analyst in an analyst company, and I have two lines of customers standing outside my door. One of these lines are vendors, and the vendors all come to me and they tell me that their product is the next best thing since sliced bread, and everybody should buy their product. The other line is end users who come to me saying, we're being told all this stuff by these vendors, but we don't really know where to choose. And so one of the things that we do as industry analysts is we work out how you can choose, in practical terms, what are the dimensions that you should be looking at in the products and in the offerings in the marketplace. And so for cloud access security brokers in 2020, we released our latest market compass, which shows how we have analyzed the market leading offerings in this market against these 9 dimensions, which you can see on the screen. And these are effectively about how well they are good at discovering the way in which cloud services are being used, how well they are actually controlling access, how well they are protecting data, and how well they help you to become compliant and to manage the way in which you are using those services, as well as being secure, easy to deploy, interoperable, and usable. And what we believe you should be looking for is a product which comes out in our spider chart here as being strongly positive in all of those areas. And there are many products that are on the market that you will find that have good points in some of those areas, but there are few that come out with top marks in everything. So I'm now going to look at, in some more depth, the capabilities that we have been looking for. And so the first thing is about discovery and control of risk. And in effect, this is what we're talking about as being zero trust. It's being able to control which user can access which data in which system, based on a clear understanding of what the risk is and having a policy which allows you to set effective controls. And this needs to work across all of the kinds of cloud environments that you may come across, both the cloud apps that you think you're using, such as the Salesforce and the CRM type things and your Office 365 or your Google apps, as well as all of the other cloud services that your employees have decided to adopt in order to get the job done, because they've been using these things previously. But are they actually secure? Are they causing an unacceptable level of risk? And one of the things that people have forgotten is that in the race to digital transformation, an awful lot of infrastructure as a service has been adopted. And one of the main causes of security breaches has been around the way in which many customers have been using those services insecurely. So what we need to do is to look at these things in some more depth. So when we're looking at zero trust and the discovery, we're first of all looking for something that will discover all of both the sanctioned and the unsanctioned, the managed or the unmanaged cloud services that are being used by your organization. That it can identify who is actually using these services, so that there is no doubt as to who it is. You know them by their corporate ID. And that it also works when those same people are accessing the services from outside of the corporate network, as well as from the inside. And that is an area which sometimes some of the products fall down on. And finally, you may well be working with partners or contractors and suppliers, and they're probably accessing things that are relevant to your organization and creating a risk. And so are you able, through this discovery, to include them in the way it all works? In terms of controlling access, what we need from this is a system which is going to provide a control point which will implement mechanisms which can control who can access what. And this involves something to do that. For example, a network proxy. Now, not everybody, not all the systems have that. They have a distributed control point, for example, based on the notion that, well, you can change the APIs inside the cloud service, and that's a bit slower. That how can you limit access to unmanaged services? It's fine for employees to use safe cloud services, but there's all kinds of stuff in those 665,000 apps that are out there, many of which I'm sure have just been created by the malicious actors who want to gather your details and gather your data by apparently providing a service. That for the managed services, there should be granular access control over what you can do, so that you can have a proper single pane of glass through which to manage all of the access in a consistent manner. And those kinds of access controls should be capable of implementing our famous principle of least privilege, which is one of the things that is essential for zero trust, and one of the things that often seems to be forgotten, as well as having, you would clearly expect to have wide coverage. Now, in addition to discovery, we need to have proper protection of data. It's not sufficient to discover the people that are accessing the services, but you also need to understand what data is being held where and what risk is posed to this. So does it contain or provide integration with mechanisms to detect and discover sensitive data that's being uploaded, stored, or downloaded? And if it does it also provide means to protect that data against misuse and leakage, for example, through techniques such as encryption or limiting access in some way or another? Does it cover all the different kinds of data that is being sent into the cloud? That it is no longer, most of the data that is being created by most of the organizations is now in unstructured form. And there is an awful lot of this data that is circulating and is actually out of control. I often say to people that the most risky part of your organization is in fact the corporate email, because nearly everything goes through your corporate email. People add attachments. How are you going to protect that? And how are you going to protect it in any case against the cyber threats? Because as the data migrates out to the cloud, this presents an opportunity to the malware people and to the adversaries, the cyber adversaries, because if it's in the cloud and you can access it, if they can figure out a way to access it, they can plant bombs into it as a way of infiltrating your organization so that when it is re-downloaded, it will in fact have been poisoned. Now that is about capabilities to do with access control, but we talked at the beginning about visibility and compliance. And so it's not sufficient to have this zero trust controls. You also need not only to be able to be complying, but also to be able to demonstrate compliance. The IT auditor, the external auditor, the regulator is unlikely to accept your assertion that everything is being managed. What they will be looking for is proof. They will say, show me. And show me is what you need evidence for. So the CASB platform should provide a proper set of key capabilities for helping you to prove your compliance, so that you can have analysis of what users are accessing what, how these risks are related and how they are being controlled, how you are able to detect and manage abnormalities, and how well your policies are being governed. And so, for example, that translates into a form of security posture management. This is answering the question from your CISO. Do you actually have governance over the way in which your users have access to the cloud services? In fact, there's an awful lot of work was done in on-premises systems, and there are a lot of tools that provide governance, role mining, management of entitlements, separations of duties, least privilege, much of which has not migrated into the cloud services. And most organizations don't have any way of consistently and centrally understanding anything around how well they are governing access by their users to the cloud and the entitlements that they have been given. And so that is the first thing. The second thing is that privileged access to cloud services is becoming the next big vulnerability and weakness. We all spent ages trying to eradicate or manage our root accounts, our administrator accounts. And I can remember going into organizations that had thousands of administrator people with administrator privileges. Well, it's becoming like that with the cloud, because every time you have a cloud service that you sanction, there are some administrators. And if you're a large organization, then you will find that administration is delegated. So each of the departments that's using the cloud service will have their own administrators, and they will have sub-administrators, and then they will have people who need it in emergencies, and they will have developers who say, well, we've got to have it because it's the only way we can manage it. But every one of those cloud privilege accounts that you own, not the ones in the cloud service provider owns, but the ones that you own, are a target for the cyber adversaries, because if you can get in there, then you can create more accounts, you can alter things, you can plant data, you can do whatever you want. So the problem of administrative privilege remains just as acute as it was, and has become more acute because, in fact, the whole system is potentially accessible by anyone. And how can you recognize those people that have excessive permissions? Well, time and time again, we have come across examples of companies that have gone bankrupt or been defrauded because of the use of privileges outside of what is needed by their employees. Well, it's the same exactly with your cloud services. And unless you have some kind of access governance in place in order to deal with that, then that problem will remain. So access controls, separation of duties, control of privileges, least privilege access, absolutely fundamental to security. You need to do it. And whilst individual cloud services may provide you with a way of doing it, very few, you have multiple cloud services. Some of them are software as a service, some of them are not, some of them are infrastructure as a service. They're all potentially vulnerable. Now, how well have you configured your service? Most of these cloud services provide quite significant capabilities to secure how they are being used. You can set permissions on who can do what. You can set permissions on objects and data within the cloud service, but have you set them correctly? And that is acute enough in software as a service. You know, if you simply take things like CRM systems have a massive amount of personal data in them. How can you be sure that it's configured so that only the people who need to see that data can see that data? If you have payment card data, how are you managing that payment card data? If you are a healthcare provider, how are you managing the healthcare data? If you have infrastructure as a service, or you're using databases or object stores, one of the major sources of leaks from object stores was buckets that had open public permissions on them that people either didn't realize they needed to set, or because they simply failed to set them. So all of these configurations are potentially vulnerable, and you need to have a way of assessing that vulnerability. Well, there were lots of on-premises vulnerability scanners, but not much for the cloud. So you need to be looking at this kind of stuff to identify and remove any of the vulnerabilities in the resources that you're using in a way which meets with your security policies, so that you can go back and you can say to your security CISO, and you can say to your risk and compliance people that we understand the controls that we have in place. We can demonstrate these controls to you, and we can prove that we are in fact working in a compliant way. And that is increasingly going to be a problem for the use of infrastructure as a service. Software as a service was the beginning, and infrastructure as a service is the tsunami that is coming down the pike, as they say. So in terms of helping you to manage compliance, many organizations are already trying to deal with acronym soup with compliance. There are so many regulations about privacy. There are so many regulations about finance and around healthcare. Being able to have some help which enables you to, out of the box, be able to inspect what you are doing with your cloud services in a way which relates to the controls and obligations that are placed on you, your organization, by those regulations, is an enormous step forward. And so out of the box reporting for that kind of stuff is really one of the key capabilities that we will be looking for, where you've got standard reports that can be configured with alerting and the ability to integrate all of this with your normal security information and event management and trouble ticketing and service desks and all this kind of thing, so that abnormalities and events can be automatically reported and recovered. Now, having looked at the capabilities, we then have to look at the architecture. And once again, architectures are not, all products are not the same in terms of their architecture. And the difference between a good product and a bad product ultimately comes down to one which was built on a thought out, secure, scalable architecture. And I'm afraid to say that not every product that we meet in the market is built in that way. And so when we look at some of the techniques that are being used, most of the CASBs had their NASMs. They started off log scraping, that they would sort of read your router or your firewall logs and tell you that you were using a certain set of cloud services. And well, that was good 10 years ago. It told you you might be using something. But in terms of allowing you to do anything, allowing you to implement a control, it's very slow, because by the time you've downloaded it and analyzed it and come up with an answer, you know, the problem is gone. You know, some people have said World War III will be over in 5 milliseconds. Well, this is what is happening. You know, if you have to be able to respond at the speed of the internet, if you are going to be able to deal with events and anomalies as they occur. So some organizations have mandate some kind of appliance on your premises, which in fact will monitor the traffic that goes through it to control that traffic. Now, I think working from home has demonstrated the Achilles heel of the VPN and the on-premises stuff, that this just doesn't scale when suddenly loads and loads of people are working out of the building. In fact, it didn't really scale when they were in the building, but now if everybody's going through some kind of a bottleneck, that doesn't work. So it's good, but it's not sufficient. One of the really good approaches is to have the ability to have a service as a proxy, which gives you all of the benefits of software as a service, which means that it is scalable, that it is expandable on your demand, but you only pay for what you need at any time. And it's immediately available as well. Now, some of the solutions in the market use the APIs provided by the cloud services to make enforcement. Well, that's good, because that's good in the sense that it means that you can have a way of implementing policies across different cloud services through a common user interface. That's good. But it's not sufficient, because if you say to them, well, how can I stop somebody who is doing something that they shouldn't do when I detect it? It's too late. By the time you've detected it, it's too late to go and change the API. The API is good for properly implementing and enforcing the policy at the time of application, but not at the time of enforcement. Agents are very useful, because agents allow you to move all this out into the end user devices, but they do add to the complexity. So if you're going to depend upon a solution which involves the use of agents, then please do make sure that you get one which has an agent system that is easy to deploy. And again, some of the vendors will make a virtue of the fact that they integrate with lots of other products in order to come up with the solution. They will integrate with the DLP, or they'll integrate with somebody else's firewall or whatever. Now, integration is good. Integration is really good. However, sometimes it's better to have the thing built into the solution. So integration is better than interoperability, if you understand what I mean. The fact that you can interoperate with an on-premises DLP solution is going to introduce delays and probably clog something up. So all of those things are the essential points that we're looking at. Now, what I'd like to do is to take a look at how the market is changing. And the market has changed. 10 years ago, people were delighted to be told that they had a system which would tell them what cloud services they were used. Nowadays, they need more than that. And what has happened is that you've got a growth of separated solution sets, which are still not fully integrated. There was a growth 15 years ago, at least 15 years ago, for data leak prevention technology. Encryption has been around for forever. Cyber threat protection is critical, and again has been around for an awful lot of time. And all of these things are relevant to the use of the cloud. And having all these multiple solutions isn't really very good. Access governance. There's an extremely mature market in identity management and access governance, which was all focused on the use in on-premises. But it hasn't yet fully matured to do with use of the cloud. Network security 20 years ago was the holy grail. We were going to have intrusion detection. We were going to build a perimeter that was going to solve everything. Those technologies, those devices are still vital, but they're not sufficient. And what is missing is an integrated hybrid cloud security management system, which provides an integration of all these things, providing across the board governed controls, giving you zero trust access and proper protection of your data, as well as supporting your security posture management and your proof of compliance. And so that leads me on to the end, that cloud security has become an essential because of the way in which COVID and digital transformation are forcing organizations to accelerate their transformation and change the way that they do business. CASB is an important element of how you can secure that, but not all CASBs are equal. And I hope, and what I've been saying today, provides you with some understanding of the things you should be looking for. And what you really should be looking for going forward is a cloud access security broker, which is part of an integrated and scalable hybrid cloud security management platform. So with that, I'll say thank you very much and hand back to Kevin.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks everybody for your questions. There's a couple that are on the line, and I apologize if we're not able to get through all of them. So I'll just go sequentially based on how they came in. Mike, the first question came in right as you were around slide number 10, so it was the spider chart in a sense. The question is, given the different functional areas, how do you make the trade-off on how you prioritize which categories or which functional areas that might be more important? Every company and every team will have different use cases. So how do you necessarily map between those considerations?
Well, you're absolutely right. And every organization is unhappy in their own way or has their own set of problems and obligations. And you have to map that to this, to these particular things. So it may well be that in some industries, you are less interested in compliance than in others. The problem is that it is becoming increasingly difficult for organizations to distance themselves from any of those dimensions. Because, there was a time when I would go to an organization and they would say, I don't understand why we need antivirus, because with the only thing we use computers for is administration. And I'm really worried about my brand as a perspective of it. Everybody's has become so digital that you can no longer rely on saying, well, I'm secure because my computer is under the desk and I've got a dog outside.
Wonderful, Mike. The second question, perhaps somewhat related to that question as well, related to these different functional groups that you may think about for CASBs. Are there some that you might consider to have more priority consideration for kind of temporary periods during a period when you might have a large remote workforce, or will these primarily be consistent regardless of, or whether these will be consistent requirements even as folks go back into either a complete on-prem environment or one where there's a hybrid setup?
Well, I think that my experience says that water doesn't flow uphill. And it's the whole of my life in the IT industry, we've been told that what we did yesterday is going to be thrown away and we're going to have something new tomorrow. And what we did yesterday never goes away. So the genie is out of the bottle, as they might say, that people have been working from home. Organizations have had to change the way they do business, and it's not going to go back. It's not, Some people will say, I can't tolerate the change. It's too upsetting. It's, they'll be in a state of denial and they will believe that they are going to live in an on-premises world in what is now becoming the cloud and open world. It isn't going to happen. It's just a question of how long they can hold the tide back. In England, we have this king that was called King Canute, who said, if I have the right to do everything, and if I sit on the beach and tell the tide not to come in, it will stop.
Great, wonderful. And then, Mike, I guess I think we'll probably have time for 2, maybe 3 more. The next question comes as a matter of adjacent categories, perhaps. The question is, how does RBI factor into access controls as you're thinking about CASBs? Do you consider them a part of a CASB requirement, or do you consider that as more of a web security requirement? And or perhaps maybe some considerations, to your point about convergence, perhaps it's more of a converged requirement nowadays.
Sorry, what was the
remote browser isolation?
Remote browser isolation. Yes, sorry. I couldn't quite hear the, I'm getting old and my ears aren't working. Well, so I think there's all kinds of different answers that people try to come up with. And in the end, each of these things have a use in some kind of limited case. And this takes me back to the need that organizations need to be looking at the fact that they are going to be using this highly heterogeneous hybrid IT environment, and that you're going to have to look for integrated and interoperable solutions that deal with all of this, and that you can pick out any one of these little niche technologies, and they're good in a certain area, but you have to fit it into this wider picture. If it's useful for you at the moment, then I'm happy for you to carry on using it. But if you look at the world that most of the organizations are going into, most organizations of any size are now in this multi-cloud hybrid world with the IT services distributed everywhere, and with the people that are using them distributed everywhere. And everything is depending upon the interconnection between them, and you don't have immediate control over most of what is in there. And so you have to adopt a different way. And this kind of integrated set of things, of which cloud access security brokers are an important element, is the way to go.
Wonderful, Mike. And perhaps a last question, and I know there are actually several that we're not going to be able to get to. So what we'll make sure to do is to capture these. And Mike, I'll share some of these questions we're not going to be able to get to with you offline. And we have the contact information for the folks who are asking them as well. And actually, perhaps before I ask the last question here, for those that are looking at other sessions in the SASEDay agenda, it is the same webinar line throughout the entire day. So you can either stay on the line throughout the day, or you can come and go as you please. So Mike, last question for the day is double click into threat protection. And I guess it's an open question. Can you speak to threat protection with CASBs?
Threat protection, well, yes. So threat protection is a really important element of all of this. And so there's all kinds of levels of views of this, but we are all now subjected to a barrage of bad stuff that comes into our organizations and tries to get into the way in which we're using systems. So, for example, we're getting files sent to us or links sent to us or things like that that are very malicious and going to cause us problems. And the CASB is going to try and help us to not go to the places that have been infected that we're being directed to. They're going to help us to deal with threat protection technologies are important because they are going to make sure that when we put them in our services, we know that they're clean, and that when we get them back, we're going to know that they're clean. And so the integration and between these different things is absolutely key to having a complete and coherent approach to the security in this hybrid multi-cloud world.
Wonderful. Well, Mike, thank you for spending the hour breaking down CASBs, requirements, how you might be able to balance those. And we'll make sure to share some of these questions we weren't able to get to by the top of the hour with you. And for those that where we didn't get a chance to get to your questions, we'll make sure to send you the answers afterwards. But Mike, thank you so much for your time today.